I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind. I have been a radio journalist for 2 decades, but a few years ago, I found myself avoiding the news for long stretches because of how depressing and divisive it all seems. I still wanted to be informed and engaged on important issues, though, and I figured I couldn't be alone in that. So we created this podcast. Each week, we tackle one tough topic in a way that will challenge you, help you feel more empathy, and empower you to become a better citizen, a kinder neighbor, and a more effective advocate. Today, we are going to hear a stick-with-it conversation from Greg Jackson, an historian best known for his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. Hey, Greg, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Julie. Pleasure to be here.
Now, as regular Top of Mind listeners know, Stick With It is a conversation series where we talk with people about this thing that is at the heart of what Top of Mind is about, that moment when you're confronted with a perspective that challenges you. And you immediately feel defensive, it's natural, and you want to bail, but you opt instead to sit with that discomfort, to stick with it and see where it might lead. Listening to Top of Mind each week is a chance to practice listening with curiosity as we probe the nuances of important issues that can be challenging at times. And this special series of conversations is a way to see what sticking with it looks like in daily life. So, Greg Jackson, really excited to hear your Stick With It story. Set it up for us. What do we need to know?
Well, as you said, Julie, I'm best known for my podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. I started that in 2017 and started it without any big money, no backing. That was just me as a university professor at Utah Valley University. And I just felt that I could take my academic rigor, what I do in the classroom, my students enjoy my lectures, and I could merge that with the storytelling that you often hear in fun history podcasts. And I felt like in podcasting, that space was not being sufficiently filled. There were a lot of excellent history podcasts out there, very few historians, though, actually kind of leading that charge. So it really grew. And this went from, it was still something being made in my basement, is still to this day being made in my basement for the most part. But suddenly I had national audience. And by suddenly, I mean over the course of, 2-3 years. As that happens, though, it's an interesting experience, Julie, because initially, any smaller podcast, they have phenomenal ratings typically. And that's because really it's mostly friends and family listening. That's right. Not to take away from the quality.
Everybody's like 5-star because, that's your
totally
friends from high school.
Exactly. Your mom is not going to tear you apart on Apple reviews. That's just not happening.
Right. But I'm sensing that as your audience grew, you were dealing with criticism in different ways than you had experienced.
100%. And, for me, this was new. I wasn't a big TV personality or, someone who already had a public persona in some other venue that came to it with some big team that's helping them out. This was me being really super glue and duct tape held together behind the scenes, as it were, putting this thing together and honored and genuinely surprised at how it was catching on, But I'm suddenly facing real criticism. And as that happened, there were kind of two things that I also had to learn. Initially, I was very reactive isn't the word I want in a negative way, but, I'd get a critique like, oh, my goodness, I must be making a terrible, terrible mistake. I'd really want to investigate and think it through. And then let that simmer for a little bit. That's when the calluses start to kick in. And it doesn't mean that I'm no longer listening, but you start to realize, when you get to a certain level, someone doesn't like every aspect of anything you do.
Mm.
So
it became easier to kind of be like, they're just the haters. I can't please everybody. I'm fine, doing fine.
Exactly. Yeah. So, trying to figure out that's the interesting thing, I think in our internet age is where you'll get bombarded once you hit a certain critical mass with people who hate the very essence of what is actually making your success. And it can be very difficult, to sort out who's the troll, who's giving you earnest, genuine good feedback, who is just your super fan that, like mom, is simply going to tell you whatever you do is awesome. But within all of that, this was 2019, maybe. I'm pretty sure we were pre-COVID, coming up on it. And so I've got a social media manager at this point. It starts to get to where you can't keep up with all the comments. That's another shift that I had to experience. I asked her to kind of pass on, things that she thinks I need my eyes on. And so she did. She passed along this message from Lucy in Tennessee, and it cut through a lot of the noise. So at that point, I'd gotten a few criticisms for some of the voices I do. Now, I, of course, try to be very sensitive to not voice historical figures that I feel would be inappropriate for me to try and lean into too much. But in my merging of academic history and storytelling, one of the things that even took me into this podcasting space was, well, I do that with my kids when I read them stories at night. You do voices for the different characters. It brings the story to life. Storytellers have done voices forever. And I've done it in the classroom even, and my students have always, they've loved it. So it's an important part of being a storyteller. But as I was getting, some people who wanted to critique this accent and that, for instance, I had one email that let me know my French accent was just the worst of all of them. And that was one of the moments where I went, okay, so I'm just getting critiques for anything and everything because I speak fluent French. So, that was part of where I really shut down on listening to any critiques in that.
But something made you pay attention to Lucy that was different. This is Lucy from Tennessee who met. And what accents? What was her critique?
Well, first of all, she really enjoyed the podcast. That was very clear. And I could feel the earnestness with which she very clearly, but very politely said, "Oh, you make us sound dumb."
Southerners. So she was taking issue with the Southern accent. And you're a U.S. history podcast for the most part, so you were doing a lot of Civil War stuff, I imagine, and founding fathers from Southern states.
Absolutely.
So a lot of opportunity for Southern accents. And she said she didn't like the way you did a Southern accent then.
Yeah, the tone that I was using, feeling stereotypical into that, the negative, stupid stereotype that is inaccurately and unfairly attributed to the South at times. The key thing, I guess, for the stick with it moment here is to bear in mind I am calloused at this point to this specific sort of critique. The way that Lucy delivered it, though, it got past the armor, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
She found that small opening that got me reflecting. So I said, okay, I'm going to engage with Lucy. And we had a back and forth, and that got me thinking harder. I called up another podcaster I know, a guy from New Orleans, and asked him about it. And we basically Lucy pushed me to start asking my other Southern friends who I know, and they've never said anything to me. But if it weren't for Lucy, I wouldn't have gotten to that place where I would have reached out to them and say, "Hey, you've never said anything to me about this, but are you bothered? Am I doing anything wrong here?"
And
they said, "We're not bothered, Greg, but honestly, you could definitely do a lot better, man. You've got one sound for the whole South. There's a rich variety of accents. There's no specific one that you're leaning into. It doesn't come across like you're doing a Missouri, a Missourian accent when you have Jefferson Davis. It just is like, almost like the Looney Tunes, sort of a bland voice. And that should be different from, someone in, say, Virginia, which should be, and are we talking Chesapeake Bay Area, or are we talking inland?"
Whoa.
And so, it was just peeling back all the layers, right?
And how'd that feel?
Not the best, of course. I mean, I've got this corpus of work out there, right? Like these are done. They are in the can. I've got years of work there. So, it creates questions of continuity. Do I not change because this is how it's been done. And and of course, it's always hard to eat crow, to eat some humble pie. Ultimately, I ended up doing Jeremy is the name of my friend who is from New Orleans. I brought him onto the show, and I did a conversation with him about Southern accents. So we just totally broke away from history and did a single episode where I basically just said, "Hey, here's the conversation." We started with this message from Lucy.
Wow, you went public with the criticism.
That felt like the right thing to do. Because as I weighed this all out, of course, one answer could be, well, you just don't do any voices. Okay, but on the other hand, I also get the messages from, it's typically parents who say, I listened to this with my kids, and thank you so much for doing voices. They can follow along. They get it. You've got a 1-hour history episode. I'm the narrator, and then I'm quoting a figure. And since I weave actual stories into the history itself, right? It's going back and forth. Being able to flip the switch on an accent really enables us to stay in this suspended space where we're still telling a story, and we don't have to exit it. We don't have to break that fourth wall, disrupt the story. So, I've got all these two different ends of the spectrum. You've got those who are saying, well, that's not exactly how we sound in my corner of the United States. Then I've got people in the other 49 states who are going to say, oh my goodness, that is so helpful to me, not knowing better. It brings me into that moment. So what's the balance, right? Like these are all the things that I'm trying to weigh out here. And I know after weighing this out, discussing things with Lucy, and then my conversation with Jeremy, I knew the answer was not to keep doing exactly what I had been doing, but I had to up my game. That was the conclusion that I came to.
How did you do that?
I realized that what I had to do is up my ability on the accents.
Did you hire a coach then, or how did you go about that?
Depending on the accent, I struggled to find a single coach that would really fit the bill. I mean, if one of your listeners happens to know some amazing accent coach that really has a massive arsenal, I would not mind at all if they reached out. But I'm all over the place because it's Southern accents for one bit of episodes, but then we get to Andrew Carnegie, and now suddenly I need Scottish. And then you've got, English players, Irish. Right now I'm in World War I. I've got Russians, Germans. So I'm all over the place. And I'm deep in the weeds making sure I get the history right. That's paramount for me. But I've worked into it, getting in touch with people who are from the region. And my ideal is I will actually take I refer to it as a script. I've written out every episode verbatim, word for word. It's usually about 9,000 words. And I would send them the segments where those scenes are, okay, and say, okay, help me through this. Sometimes that's them reading them in a voicemail, and they message that back to me, whether that's texting, Facebook Messenger, you name it. And what I have learned is I'm a very good parrot. So I might not actually be able to turn on the accent for just extemporaneous speaking purposes. But a gentleman in Scotland that a friend of mine was able to get me in touch with, he read, for instance, when I got to Andrew Carnegie, he read back to me every line in that episode that was a quote from Carnegie, and I parroted him. And I actually got compliments from Scottish listeners afterwards. So I thought, okay, now I'm there.
So how? Yeah. So just in terms of the outcome, right? Making this choice, like not to ignore it, not to sort of be like, and nothing I can do about it, or I'm going to stop doing accents. You're like, I'm going to pick the hard way. I'm going to lean into this. I'm going to stay curious. And you're doing more work as a result, but
much more work, really. It sucks.
Are you kidding?
No, I mean, it's fun.
It's just less complaints. I mean, pretty soon you're going to.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Less complaints. That's good. That must be gratifying then.
Oh, it's very gratifying. And of course, the old episodes, they're there. So, and I'm still very proud of that work. I love the old episodes. I learned so much making them. And they're great, but being able to make that shift, make that improvement when I've got so much American history yet ahead of me to tell. And this is an immigrant nation. So yes, it's more work, but it's my honor to get it right. That's important.
And what became of Lucy, the woman who started
Lucy,
it all?
Lucy's a dear friend now.
And is she your go-to in Tennessee when you have to do a Tennessean accent?
100%. Yep. When it's an Andrew Jackson moment. And in fact, I'll tell you, we've now met a couple of times. I had never been to Tennessee when I started this podcast. And when she reached out to me, I had never been to Tennessee. In fact, I'd my entire some experience in the South. And this probably speaks to the terrible ability that I had previously when it came to Southern accents. I had gone to one academic conference in New Orleans one time. That was my some experience in the South. All that said, I then suddenly had opportunities to go to Tennessee. There was a conference that took me to Nashville. I ended up doing a live show in the Memphis area. And these are very different, regions, but I was able to meet up with Lucy, and she actually met me in the Capitol and arranged for a tour of the Capitol building itself. So, we grabbed lunch and hung out for the day. I basically just took that day off from the conference to be able to hang out with my now dear friend that I'd known through the internet for, I think, well over a year by that point.
Well, it's a great story. And I love that the choice to engage, to stick with it, stick with that discomfort, like we say. I love that opened up both a new relationship, created some empathy, prompted some soul searching, which is often the case for me with stick with it moments, and then made you better at your job.
Well, and I have to tell you, Julie, because Lucy made me promise to tell you this when I texted her. She said, you have to tell the person interviewing you that you have a much, much better Southern accent now. You have come light years. So, well,
there you go.
We'll make sure to note that.
Greg Jackson is the host of the popular and very engaging podcast History That Doesn't Suck. He's appeared on several History Channel documentaries, and the lucky students at Utah Valley University happen to get him as their professor as well. Greg, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure.
Now let's hear your Stick With It story, Top of Mind listener. Email topofmind@byu.edu about a time when you encountered a perspective that challenged your way of seeing things, and you chose to stick with that discomfort rather than shut down. How'd it go? What was the result? Again, that email address is topofmind@byu.edu. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.